The soft hum of engines filled the air as passengers began boarding the first-class cabin. Daniel, a casually dressed man in his mid-30s, walked down the aisle carrying a worn leather bag. He wore a simple hoodie and jeans, his sneakers slightly scuffed. He didn't stand out in the luxurious setting of first class, where the seats were wide, and the air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and fresh coffee. Finding his seat by the window, Daniel settled in quietly. He placed his bag under the seat, opened a thick book, and adjusted his noise-canceling headphones. Though he seemed unbothered by the glances from other passengers, it was clear to some that he didn't fit the usual image of a first-class traveler. Moments later, Vivian entered the cabin. She was tall, confident, and dressed in a sharp navy blue pantsuit. Her high heels clicked loudly on the floor as she made her way toward her seat. Her perfectly styled hair and designer handbag made it clear she was someone who took pride in appearances. As she reached her row, her eyes immediately landed on Daniel. Her polished expression shifted into a slight frown. She hesitated for a moment, checking her ticket again, almost as if she hoped she was in the wrong row. But no, the seat next to Daniel was hers. "Excuse me," she said curtly, motioning for him to move so she could get to her seat. Daniel looked up, smiled politely, and stood, allowing her to pass. As Vivian settled in, she couldn't help but glance at Daniel's hoodie and sneakers. She let out a small sigh, just loud enough for him to hear. "First class isn't what it used to be," she muttered under her breath, adjusting her handbag on her lap. Daniel didn't react, pretending to be absorbed in his book. However, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, as if he had heard her but chose not to engage. Vivian glanced out the window, her frustration evident. I thought they had standards for who they let sit here," she murmured, this time loud enough for the flight attendant passing by to hear. The attendant looked slightly uncomfortable, but said nothing, continuing down the aisle. Daniel remained calm, his eyes fixed on the pages of his book. His composure only seemed to irritate Vivian more. As the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, Vivian continued to fidget in her seat, occasionally glancing at Daniel, as if she expected him to do something out of place. She shook her head once, muttering something under her breath again. For Daniel, it was just another day, but for Vivian, it was the start of a flight she didn't expect to be so different. The flight was well underway, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly, giving the first-class section a calm, peaceful atmosphere. Vivian, however, didn't seem at peace. She glanced over at Daniel, who had removed his headphones and was now typing away on a laptop. His relaxed demeanor seemed to irritate her even more. As the flight attendant served drinks, Vivian leaned slightly toward the attendant and asked, "Is first class always this casual nowadays?" She glanced pointedly at Daniel's hoodie before looking back at the attendant. The flight attendant smiled politely, unsure how to respond, and simply nodded before walking away. Daniel caught the interaction out of the corner of his eye, but didn't say anything. Instead, he continued typing as if he hadn't noticed. Vivian sighed loudly and crossed her arms. "I just don't understand why some people think they can show up to first class dressed like they're going to the gym," she said, her voice sharp enough for Daniel to hear. Finally, Daniel glanced up from his laptop and met her gaze. His expression was calm, and his tone was polite. "Comfort is important on long flights," he said with a small smile, then returned to his work. Vivian blinked, caught off guard by his response. She hadn't expected him to say anything, let alone respond so casually. She scoffed and muttered under her breath, "Comfort doesn't mean abandoning basic standards." As the flight attendants began serving the meal, Vivian continued to find small ways to criticize Daniel. When he asked for a vegetarian option, she rolled her eyes. "Of course," she said quietly, barely hiding her disdain. Daniel remained unbothered, politely thanking the attendant and eating his meal without acknowledging her comments. This only seemed to fuel Vivian's frustration. "You know," she said after a while, leaning slightly toward him, It's not just about money to sit in first class. It's about knowing how to behave and carry yourself. Some people think they can just buy their way in without understanding that. Daniel paused, fork halfway to his mouth. He turned to her, his expression calm but firm. "Is that so?" he asked simply, his tone giving nothing away. Vivian smiled, clearly misinterpreting his neutral response as agreement. "Exactly. It's about class. It's a mindset, not just a seat." Daniel nodded slightly, turning back to his meal. "You're absolutely right," he said with a polite smile. "Class is definitely a mindset." Vivian froze for a moment, unsure if he was agreeing with her or subtly pointing out her behavior. Before she could respond, Daniel returned to his meal, leaving her to sit in silence. The quiet didn't last long. Vivian couldn't help herself. She huffed and muttered, "Unbelievable," under her breath. But this time, Daniel didn't even look up. The rest of the flight promised to be long, and more awkward than Vivian had expected. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight attendants collected the empty trays from dinner service. The soft hum of the airplane engines was interrupted only by the occasional clink of glasses or quiet conversation between passengers. Vivian, however, remained restless. She shifted in her seat, glancing repeatedly at Daniel, as if waiting for him to do something worth criticizing. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. He had finished his meal, neatly folded his napkin, and was now jotting notes in a small leather notebook. His calm demeanor only seemed to irritate Vivian more. She leaned back in her seat with a sigh, staring out the window. When Daniel accidentally dropped his pen, it rolled toward Vivian's feet. He leaned over slightly and said, "Excuse me," in a polite tone. But before he could reach for it, Vivian picked it up and handed it to him with an exaggerated smile. "You're welcome," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Daniel took the pen and smiled warmly. "Thank you," he said, as though her tone didn't bother him at all. He returned to his notebook, and once again, Vivian found herself annoyed. As the flight continued, Vivian decided to strike up a conversation with a fellow passenger across the aisle, a man wearing a crisp suit. Loud enough for Daniel to hear, she said, "Don't you think first class is losing its charm? It used to feel exclusive, but now it's just crowded." The man looked a bit startled by the question, but nodded politely, clearly not wanting to engage in anything controversial. "I suppose things have changed a bit," he said, offering a neutral reply before turning back to his tablet. Vivian smiled, satisfied that she had made her point. She glanced at Daniel, expecting some kind of reaction, but he remained focused on his notebook. His calmness felt infuriating to her, though she couldn't quite explain why. The flight attendants returned to offer drinks and desserts. When Daniel requested herbal tea, Vivian raised her eyebrows and muttered, "How quaint." She laughed softly, as if expecting others to join in. This time, Daniel looked at her directly. His gaze was steady, and though his expression was friendly, there was a quiet strength in his tone. "I find it relaxing," he said simply. Vivian blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the firmness in his voice. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. The awkward silence that followed seemed to stretch longer than it actually was. Other passengers began to notice the tension between the two. A few exchanged glances, clearly wondering what was going on. Some looked curious. Others looked uncomfortable. Vivian crossed her arms and turned away, staring out the window again. She tapped her fingers on the armrest, her frustration growing. Meanwhile, Daniel leaned back in his seat, took a sip of his tea, and calmly resumed his work. The tension hung in the air, but if it bothered him, he gave no sign of it. The plane soared steadily through the clouds, and the cabin was quiet except for the occasional clink of glasses and the low hum of the engines. Vivian, still annoyed by the casual man beside her, tapped her manicured nails on the armrest. She had spent most of the flight alternating between irritated sighs and judgmental glances at Daniel, who seemed completely unaffected. Daniel had closed his notebook and was now scrolling through something on his laptop. His calm, collected demeanor only made Vivian more determined to figure him out. She leaned slightly toward him, pretending to glance at the screen, and said with a thin smile, "You seem very busy for someone who dresses like they're on vacation." Daniel paused and looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Busy, yes," he said with a polite smile. "But I try to stay comfortable while I work. Long flights can be exhausting." Vivian raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his response. "Work, huh? Let me guess. You're in sales," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Daniel chuckled softly and shook his head. "Not quite," he replied, his voice calm and measured. "I work with people, though. You could say my job involves problem solving." Vivian smirked, thinking she had figured him out. "Ah, so customer service," she guessed, her voice laced with condescension. Daniel smiled again, unbothered by her tone. "Something like that," he said, turning back to his laptop. Their brief exchange caught the attention of a flight attendant, who approached with a friendly smile. "Mr. Chambers, is there anything else I can get you?" she asked politely, addressing Daniel by his last name. Vivian froze for a moment, her curiosity piqued. She glanced at Daniel, who gave the attendant a warm smile and replied, "No, thank you. I'm fine for now." The flight attendant nodded and left, but not before Vivian leaned slightly closer to Daniel. "Mr. Chambers," she repeated, trying to sound casual but unable to hide her curiosity. "That sounds formal." Daniel turned to her, his smile unwavering. "It's just a name," he said simply. Vivian narrowed her eyes, sensing there was more to him than she had assumed. "You must be someone important," she said, half joking, but clearly fishing for information. Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "Everyone's important in their own way," he said, his tone neutral but thoughtful. Vivian didn't know how to respond to that. For the first time since the flight began, she found herself unsure of how to approach him. Her assumptions about him didn't seem to match up with his calm confidence and the subtle hints he had dropped. As Daniel returned to his work, Vivian sat back in her seat, her thoughts racing. Who exactly was this man, and why did he seem so comfortable in a world she had assumed he didn't belong in? The tension between them shifted, and for the first time, Vivian felt a flicker of doubt about her initial judgment. The flight continued smoothly, with the lights dimmed for the passengers' comfort. Vivian sat in her seat, still mulling over her earlier conversation with Daniel. There was something about him that didn't add up. His casual appearance, calm demeanor, and the way the flight attendant addressed him as Mr. Chambers had planted a seed of curiosity, and perhaps unease, in her mind. Daniel closed his laptop and leaned back in his seat, gazing out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. Vivian's curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to engage him once again. "So, Mr. Chambers," she began, her tone slightly less sharp than before. "You've been working a lot this flight. What exactly do you do?" Daniel turned to her, his expression friendly but unreadable. "I manage a team," he replied simply. Vivian leaned forward slightly. "A team? What kind of team?" "Sports. Tech," she pressed, determined to figure him out. Daniel smiled faintly. "A little of everything," he said, giving nothing away. Frustrated by his vague answers, Vivian tried a different approach. "You must travel a lot for work," she said, her voice tinged with skepticism. "Do you always fly first class?" Daniel's smile widened just a bit. "Sometimes," he replied. "I like to see how things operate from a customer's perspective." That response caught Vivian off guard. "Customer's perspective," she repeated, her curiosity growing. "You're in customer service after all, aren't you?" Daniel shook his head gently, his smile never wavering. "Not exactly," he said. "But I do think it's important to understand people, how they think, how they feel, and how they're treated." Vivian was about to ask another question when the pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, ensuring that all passengers were prepared for landing. Vivian noticed that one of the attendants handed Daniel a small note, which he read briefly before tucking it into his pocket. When the plane landed and came to a stop at the gate, the passengers began gathering their belongings. Vivian, still curious, watched as Daniel calmly retrieved his bag and stood up. She couldn't help but notice that several airline staff members were waiting just outside the cabin door. As soon as Daniel stepped out, they greeted him warmly, with firm handshakes and respectful smiles. "Mr. Chambers, welcome back," one of them said. "The team is ready for the meeting." Vivian froze in her seat, her mouth slightly open. Meeting. Team. Who exactly was this man? As Daniel exchanged a few words with the staff, one of the attendants entered the cabin to retrieve something he had forgotten. She glanced at Vivian and said casually, "Isn't it incredible? That's Daniel Chambers, the CEO of one of the top companies in the country." Vivian felt her stomach drop. The man she had spent the entire flight judging and insulting wasn't just a regular first-class passenger. He was a CEO, someone far more successful and influential than she could have imagined. And she had been so wrong about him. As the other passengers began disembarking, Vivian remained frozen in her seat, her mind racing. Daniel Chambers, the CEO of a major company. How could she have missed the signs? She replayed every comment, every judgmental glance, and every sarcastic remark she had made during the flight. Embarrassment flooded her. She watched as Daniel stepped out of the cabin, surrounded by the staff who greeted him with admiration and respect. One of them handed him a tablet, and another showed him some papers to review. His calm, unassuming presence suddenly made sense. This wasn't a man pretending to belong in first class. He belonged there more than anyone. Vivian quickly grabbed her bag and followed behind the other passengers, hoping to sneak past without drawing attention to herself. But as she approached the jet bridge, she realized that Daniel and his team were standing right at the gate, talking. There was no way to avoid him. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, forcing a polite smile. "Mr. Chambers," she said hesitantly, her voice quieter than usual. Daniel turned to her, his expression still kind and composed. "Yes," he replied. Vivian felt her face flush as she struggled to find the right words. I just wanted to apologize if I said anything rude earlier," she said, her tone far more humble than it had been during the flight. "I didn't realize who you were." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly, his gaze steady. "Who I am shouldn't matter," he said gently. "Everyone deserves respect, no matter how they're dressed or where they come from." Vivian's cheeks burned, and she nodded quickly. "You're absolutely right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong to judge you." Daniel gave her a small smile, the kind that held no malice or anger. "It's never too late to see things differently," he said simply. "Have a good day, Vivian." Vivian watched as he walked away with his team, leaving her standing at the gate. She felt a strange mix of relief, regret, and a twinge of admiration. Despite everything she had said, Daniel had handled it with grace and dignity. He hadn't retaliated or belittled her. He had simply shown her what true class looked like. As she made her way through the airport, Vivian found herself reflecting on her behavior. She had always prided herself on being sophisticated and successful, yet she had judged someone based on appearances alone. And in doing so, she had completely missed the chance to learn from someone far wiser than herself. For Daniel, it was just another day, one more flight, one more lesson in understanding people. But for Vivian, it was a moment she wouldn't forget. She vowed to carry this lesson with her. Respect wasn't just for those who looked the part. It was for everyone, regardless of their clothes, their job, or their background. And sometimes, the people who seem out of place might be the ones who belong there the most. Vivian walked through the airport, her heels clicking against the polished floors, but her thoughts drowned out the noise. She couldn't shake the embarrassment she felt after realizing who Daniel was. The memory of her judgmental remarks and condescending tone played over and over in her mind, making her cringe. She saw Daniel and his team ahead, walking toward a private lounge. For a moment, She hesitated, unsure if she should approach him again. Would he even want to talk to her? After all, she had spent the entire flight undermining him. But deep down, Vivian knew she needed to apologize properly. Gathering her courage, she quickened her pace and caught up to him just before he entered the lounge. "Mr. Chambers," she called out softly, trying to keep her voice steady. Daniel paused and turned, his team stopping as well. His calm, composed expression didn't waver, and he gave her a polite nod. "Yes." Vivian felt her cheeks flush again, but she pushed through her nerves. I just wanted to apologize again," she said earnestly, "for the things I said on the flight. I was rude, and I judged you without knowing anything about you. That was wrong of me." Daniel studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful but kind. "You've already apologized once," he said gently. "Why are you apologizing again?" Vivian hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I realize now how unfair I was. I made assumptions based on how you looked, and I let my own pride get in the way. I was so focused on appearances that I forgot what really matters." Daniel's gaze softened, and he offered her a small smile. "It takes a lot to admit when we're wrong," he said, "and I appreciate your honesty. But you don't owe me anything. What's important is that you've learned something from this." Vivian nodded quickly, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. "I have," she said. "I'll remember this the next time I find myself judging someone too quickly." Daniel extended his hand, surprising her. "Then I wish you the best," he said warmly. Vivian shook his hand, feeling the sense of closure she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said sincerely. As Daniel turned to enter the lounge with his team, Vivian stood there for a moment, watching him go. She couldn't help but admire how composed and gracious he was. It wasn't just his title or his success that impressed her. It was his humility and the way he treated others, even those who had been unkind to him. Walking away, Vivian felt lighter. This encounter had taught her a valuable lesson. Success wasn't just about wealth or appearances, it was about character. And Daniel Chambers had shown her that true class came from within. As she exited the airport, Vivian made a silent promise to herself. From now on, she would see people for who they were, not for how they looked. The airport buzzed with the usual rush of travelers, but Vivian felt like she was walking in a different world. As she made her way to her next gate, she couldn't stop thinking about her encounter with Daniel. She had spent the entire flight assuming he didn't belong in first class, only to find out he was a successful CEO, someone far beyond what she had imagined. Vivian had always prided herself on her sharp judgment. She was used to sizing people up based on their clothes, their accents, and the way they carried themselves. But this experience had shaken that belief. She had learned a lesson she hadn't expected, and one she couldn't ignore. She sat down on a bench near her gate, her mind racing. How many times had she judged people in the past without really knowing them? How many opportunities had she missed to connect with others, simply because she had dismissed them based on appearances? Daniel had been a mirror to her own faults. He was kind, humble, and unbothered by her rude comments, and yet he had shown more class than she ever could have imagined. Vivian felt a sudden rush of gratitude. Daniel hadn't raised his voice or snapped back at her. He had remained composed and showed her the dignity she had lacked. He hadn't needed to prove anything to her. Instead, he had quietly taught her the value of humility and respect. The more she thought about it, the more Vivian realized that it wasn't just about being kind to others. It was about understanding them too. People weren't defined by their appearance or their social status. There was more to everyone than what met the eye. As she waited for her flight, Vivian began to make a mental list of things she wanted to change about her approach to people. She knew she had a lot to learn, but this encounter had sparked a desire to become more open-minded, more thoughtful. The announcement for her flight came over the loudspeaker, and Vivian stood up, gathering her things. But before she boarded, she paused. For a brief moment, she looked around the crowded terminal, seeing it through new eyes. Everyone around her had their own story, their own struggles, and their own dreams. And each person, no matter who they were, deserved to be treated with respect and kindness. As the plane took off and she gazed out the window, Vivian made a silent promise to herself. She would never again let assumptions shape her view of others. She would take the time to understand people before judging them. After all, no one's worth could be measured by the clothes they wore or the way they spoke. The lesson Daniel had unknowingly taught her wasn't just about how to treat others. It was about how to treat herself. By showing respect to those around her, Vivian could create the kind of world she wanted to live in. A world where people looked beyond appearances and saw the value in each other, no matter their status or background. Vivian smiled to herself, feeling lighter, more at peace. It had been an awkward and uncomfortable flight, but it had been the most important one of her life, and it was a journey she wouldn't forget. Back at the police station, the air was thick with tension. Word of the incident had already spread, and officers exchanged nervous glances as Chief Marcus Hale walked into the briefing room. His calm demeanor betrayed none of the frustration simmering beneath the surface. Officer Carter followed behind, his head slightly bowed, aware that all eyes were on him. Marcus turned to face the room, his gaze steady as he addressed the assembled officers. "I want to make one thing clear," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "What happened today was unacceptable, not just for me, but for this department and the community we serve." The room was silent. Even Carter didn't dare to speak. He stood off to the side, his arms crossed, looking uncomfortable but unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Marcus continued, his tone firm but not unkind. "We are here to protect and serve all people, regardless of their background, appearance, or circumstances. That means following proper procedures and acting with respect, professionalism, and fairness." Ramirez and Jenkins, seated near the front, nodded in agreement. Other officers shifted in their seats, some looking thoughtful, others avoiding eye contact. It was clear that Marcus's words were hitting home. Turning his attention directly to Carter, Marcus spoke evenly. "Officer Carter, you made a series of poor decisions today. You allowed your assumptions to guide your actions instead of following protocol. You failed to verify my identity properly and escalated a situation that could have been resolved with a simple call to dispatch." Carter's face reddened as he finally looked up. "Chief, I was only trying to protect." He started, but Marcus raised a hand to stop him. "This is not about intentions, Officer Carter," Marcus said firmly. "It's about accountability. Every officer in this room has a responsibility to uphold the values of this department. When we fail to do that, we lose the trust of the community." The room remained silent, the gravity of Marcus's words sinking in. Even those who had initially dismissed him as the new guy couldn't deny the truth of what he was saying. "Today's incident is being reviewed by the Internal Affairs Department," Marcus continued. "We will address what happened fairly and transparently. In the meantime, Officer Carter, you are placed on administrative leave effective immediately. You will be required to attend additional training sessions to ensure this does not happen again." Carter opened his mouth as if to protest, but then closed it again, realizing there was nothing he could say to defend himself. He nodded stiffly, muttering, "Yes, Chief." Marcus took a deep breath, scanning the room. "This is not just about one incident," he said, addressing everyone. "This is about creating a culture of accountability, respect, and integrity. I expect all of you to reflect on what happened today and strive to do better." The officers nodded, some more reluctantly than others. Marcus's words hung in the air as the meeting concluded, marking the beginning of a new chapter for the department and for Officer Carter. The quiet neighborhood had turned into a stage for an unfolding drama. Officer Daniel Carter stood stiffly, his hand hovering near his gun, as he stared down Marcus Hale, the man claiming to be the new police chief. Neighbors cautiously watched from behind curtains, whispering to each other about what was happening. Marcus, still calm and collected, raised his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "Officer, I suggest you take a step back and think this through," he said, his voice steady but firm. This isn't how we handle things. But Carter wasn't listening. His mind raced with doubt and suspicion. In his view, Marcus didn't fit the image of someone who could be in charge. He wasn't in uniform. He wasn't someone Carter recognized. And to him, the situation just didn't add up. "Don't move," Carter snapped, ignoring Marcus's explanation. "You're not going anywhere until we sort this out." Marcus took a deep breath. He had spent years in law enforcement, handling far worse situations than this, but it still amazed him how quickly assumptions could cloud judgment. He could see the tension in Carter's posture, the way his hand stayed close to his weapon, and he knew this could spiral out of control if he wasn't careful. "I've already shown you my badge," Marcus said calmly. "If you need further proof, call the station. They'll confirm everything." Carter's lips tightened. He glanced at the badge again, but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "Badges can be faked. You think I'm just going to take your word for it?" He shot back, his voice rising. Meanwhile, more neighbors had come outside, drawn by the raised voices. A few had their phones out, recording the interaction. Carter noticed this, and it only added to his frustration. He felt like he was losing control of the situation, and his pride wouldn't let that happen. "I'm not repeating myself," Carter barked. "Step away from the car, keep your hands where I can see them, and don't try anything funny." Marcus did as instructed, but his patience was wearing thin. "Officer," he said, keeping his voice calm, "you're making a mistake. I understand you're trying to do your job, but this is not the way to handle it." Carter felt a surge of anger at those words. A mistake. No one questioned his judgment, especially not someone he didn't trust. He stepped closer, his hand now resting firmly on the grip of his gun. The tension was palpable. The crowd of onlookers murmured nervously, their phones capturing every second. Marcus held his ground, knowing he needed to stay calm even as the situation grew more dangerous. Just then, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Backup was on the way. For Marcus, it was a sign that things might soon be resolved. For Carter, it only heightened his determination to prove he was in control. The stage was set for a confrontation that neither man would forget.